Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Bloomington, Monroe County, and the League of Women Voters of Brown County, and the Greater Bloomington Chamber of Commerce, I'd like to welcome you to the fourth and final legislative update for 2021. My name is Mary Morgan. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Public Policy from the Chamber, and I'm also a League member. I'll be moderating this session today. Ann Birch is the president of the Bloomington Monroe County League. She's also here today. Sherry Frank, who is also here, is the president of the Brown County League. And Ralph Shaw, who is co-chair of our Voter Service Committee, is our question moderator. We thank them very much for their service with the League. This morning, our local legislators are going to report on their work and priorities for the current session of the Indiana General Assembly. They'll each have 10 minutes to make a presentation, and after that, we'll welcome questions from the audience. I believe that we only have, at this point, one legislator here, but we are hoping that others will join us as we go through the session today. All right, I'm just going to go over the question period. At that point, or actually any time during the session, you can alert the question moderator on chat if you have a question, and she will put you in the queue. You'll be recognized in the order that you submit a request, and you'll be asked to unmute at that point and turn on your video when it's time to pose your question. Please don't use chat for conversations, as we believe this distracts all of us from the purpose of this program, which is to learn from our legislators. When it does come time for questions, please limit your question to 1 minute. Our timer will give you a little chime when 10 seconds are left. If you have any additional questions, you can hold them in reserve, and after everyone has had a chance to ask their question, additional questions will be asked if time remains. Posing a question constitutes your permission to be recorded by Community Access Television, or CATS, and we appreciate that they're here today. This morning is intended as an informative session, an opportunity to get an update from our legislators, and it's not a time to make public statements, tempting as that may be, or to engage in debate. Please frame your questions to elicit information for the benefit of all of us and to enable all of the legislators to weigh in. You may agree or disagree with the legislators' comments, but we ask you to be respectful, please. I'm going to stop screen sharing now and welcome our legislators and ask them to please turn on their videos. We have with us today Representative Matt Pierce, representing District 61, Representative Peggy Mayfield, representing District 60. And I think for the moment that those are our only two legislators. So welcome, thank you so much for being here. And let's start with Matt, since I believe you were here first. Please give us your 10-minute presentation on what's happening with the legislature this year. Thank you.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Just doing a quick audio check here. Everybody can hear me okay? Very good, okay. Well, I would say that the kind of the biggest news of the day when it comes to the legislature is the Senate version of the budget bill, which I think will end up in the final version, is a provision that extends this legislative session, which normally would have to end no later than April 29th. It now will extend until November 15th. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to be in session day in and day out during that whole time. What's kind of triggered this approach is, you might have heard, the census data is delayed. Normally, we would already have the census data. People would be furiously drawing maps, and there would be new legislative and congressional maps adopted before the legislature would adjourn at its normal time on April 29th. Well, because we don't have that data, and the federal census people say they think they'll have the data by the end of September. They might have some raw data for us to look at a month before, but I think it's unlikely that we'll have the data we need to really draw the maps until the beginning of October. And so by not adjourning sine die, as they say, without a date, basically ending the session, what can happen is, if committees want to continue to meet, they can do that. And so I think that what you're likely to see is a scenario where the elections committees in the House and the Senate may be out having hearings about the maps once they get the data or have something they can kind of work with to get some public input. And then the maps will get drawn. And once they're ready for some kind of approval, then the legislature will probably, the full legislature would come back into session, probably sometime in October, early November. The kind of an open question, which will be interesting to see, is, you know, once the committees have voted those bills with the maps in them out of committee, will the legislature simply come back for a one-day session where the normal 3 separate reading days of the bill are suspended, and you could have a very quick, you know, 1 hour, 2 hour session and the maps are adopted and we're done? Or will the leadership opt to have a more regular process where you might have the bill committee report get adopted one day, 2 days later have second reading where people can offer amendments, and then the day after that have third reading on the bill, make it like a 1 week mini session? So there's 2 ways the leadership could do that. They could be quick in and quick out and just approve it and that's it. Or they could have a little bit more open process that might last, you know, 3 or 4 days, maybe possibly weeks. That's what I think will be interesting to see. Now, on the redistricting front, as you know, there's been a great deal of debate over the last decade, I guess, about whether we should continue with the same old process of the majority party, whoever that might be, controlling what the maps are going to look like, or whether you should move to some kind of commission or other nonpartisan system. So in the past couple of weeks, I offered a couple opportunities for the House of Representatives to vote for a nonpartisan system based on the way it works in Iowa. So in Iowa, they have their version of Legislative Services Agency draw the maps, and they have this kind of iterative process where the map is drawn without looking at political data. It's presented to the House and the Senate over there, and they vote. And most of the time they reject the first map, and they provide kind of a list of objections, things they don't like about the maps. That nonpartisan Legislative Services Agency then goes back and draws a second map based on the feedback it's gotten, and then presents the second map. And the thing is, when the maps are presented, they can't be amended. It's kind of, other than technical amendments. So it's like a straight up or down vote on whatever that map would be created. Most of the time, I think all the time from hearing from people in Iowa, the second map is adopted, because if you don't approve the second map, when the third map arrives, then it's kind of open season. Anybody can amend that map. And so kind of an ethics developed in Iowa where you have this nonpartisan system of drawing the maps without political data being considered. You do have some input. Ultimately, the legislature is voting on it and approving it. And I think that's a pretty good system. And they've had it in place. I think they might have passed it in the 70s, and maybe the first time it got used was in 1980. But it's been around for several decades and seems to work pretty well over there. And the thing that's really telling about that is my understanding is no one's ever introduced a bill to repeal that system, to try to change it. You think it'd be really tempting for the majority party to just want to go ahead and switch that up when they would have the power to make the districts more favorable to them. But apparently that hasn't happened over there. Anyway, so my first attempt to offer that to a bill about various elections matters was ruled non-germane to the bill. They said it wasn't sufficiently related to elections to be in that bill. And so we were knocked out there. But then we had another elections bill come out, and I was able to offer what they call a minority committee report, basically a motion to say, hey, instead of adopting a committee report passed by the full committee, let's replace that with a committee report proposed by someone who voted against the original report, which was me. And in that, we had that Iowa system of redistricting. And so we did finally get an up or down vote on that. It was pretty much a party line vote and was not approved. So we still have time. Nothing's going to happen until this fall, but it's looking less and less likely that we'll have any type of nonpartisan system for redrawing the maps. So that's kind of where we are on that. Let's see. The other interesting thing too about being in session technically until November 15th, although the speaker did say in his press availability that would be extremely, I think he used extraordinary, maybe was the word, he's like 3 times for the legislature to come into session before it was time to approve those maps in the fall. But it is an option that's available, perhaps to deal with appropriations of all this federal money that's coming in. There's been a lot of debate about whether you should just let the governor, who kind of controlled the first round of money from the federal government, just decide where he thinks it's best spent, or maybe not spend it all, or whether the legislature should actually appropriate some of that money. Now, in the Senate version of the budget, they've gone ahead and appropriated some of that money for one-time things. So there's a little bit of movement there. But as you know, if we get an infrastructure bill passed, for example, in the next couple of months, and maybe there's more federal money coming for that, if the legislature wanted to, by technically being in session, you know, the speaker could simply, the leaders of the House and the Senate could simply call us back on pretty short notice, and you could adopt a bill pretty quickly that would appropriate that money if you wanted to. So it's an interesting situation where the governor kind of now has to think about when he makes decisions about how to spend that money. If he does it in a way that the legislative leaders are not happy with, they now have a mechanism to immediately come into session. Otherwise, if we adjourned, sine die, basically permanently adjourned, the only way we could get back into session before Organization Day in November is if the governor were to call us back. So that's the situation there. On the budget, the vouchers and the educational savings accounts are still expanded in the Senate budget, just at a much lower level. So I think it's pretty clear that there will be these new educational savings accounts. There will be additional eligibility for those education vouchers, and it's just a matter of where that shakes out. I heard the Speaker of the House say that the House Republicans would be fighting hard to move that number back closer to where they had it coming out of the House. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Funding for the arts, I've been concerned about that. The Indiana Arts Commission, which has money that then gets sent out for arts grants, which has been very beneficial for our community. The House budget, I think the governor may have proposed a reduction. I'm not sure about that, but at any rate, the House had less money in this biennium than the last biennium for arts funding. The Senate left that alone, so that kind of makes it look like there's going to be less money for the arts unless something changes. But if each side in its base budget has agreed that the funding should be lower for the arts, that's probably where it's going to drop out. So we'll have to see about that. The Senate did increase a bit mental health funding and funding for a program called Recovery Works, which is designed to help people be diverted out of the criminal justice system to address addictions and other mental health issues that contributed to them being incarcerated in the first place. And so, you know, the good news is that more money was added back into that, but it's not still up to where it was before. It's a bit distressing. Nothing at all on teacher pay. I mean, it's pretty clear to me that the legislative leaders have decided that the teacher pay is just going to have to be up to the locals to figure out how to do that if they want to, which is a little surprising to me going into the session. I would have anticipated there being at least some kind of token down payment or something that might be available to increase some teacher pay. But I think the attitude of the budget writers now is that, you know, we'll give you as much money as we think we can. And if you want to prioritize teacher pay out of your own local budget, school boards, you can do that. So that was a little bit surprising to me that kind of turned that. And I guess the other big thing on the budget is I think it's April 15th, we'll have an update of the budget forecast. And that will tell us whether the experts think we'll have more money or less money than currently anticipated. Oftentimes, if they say, hey, we're going to have more money, that gives an opportunity for the budget writers to add more money in. And so we'll just have to see, you know, how that works out. And you would think that with revenues seem to be running ahead of forecast so far, and we have a lot of this federal money coming in, so you would think that we would be able to avoid having to cut any of these programs. It seems like we could at least maintain them at the current level. Let's see. So other interesting education bills that are moving. I think it's Senate Bill 358. We already have in law that if you are a school system and you shut a building down, you have you close an elementary school or something. under the statute, you have to give first opportunity for a charter school to purchase that building for $1. And this is kind of rankled the schools, as you can imagine, because they might have been able to sell that building for its market value and use that for some other projects. But they have this $1. And apparently the legislature doesn't think that schools are adhering to that the way they should. So they have this new bill where you have to have the Attorney General certify before you can sell the building that you gave first opportunity to charter schools. And it's kind of like a weird enforcement tool from the Attorney General to make sure that if there's any possibility to have that building go for $1 instead of being sold in the market, that's the way it will work. And then there's another controversial bill, I think it's Senate Bill 205, that's about teacher licensing. It creates another pathway. It simply says if you have a bachelor's degree and you want to be a teacher, you can go through this alternate certification process. But apparently there's no real requirements for what that certification project should be, or certification should look like, as far as GPA or requirements and things. And so that's just another example of where I think that some people feel that, you know, to be a teacher, you don't really need that much training. Seems to be the message there. Okay, Mary, how am I doing on time? Have I hit my limit?
You've hit it, Representative Pierce. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your insights. Representative Mayfield, can you share with us your updates? Thank you.
Okay, there. Sure, and just to double back on a few things that Matt has brought up, it's my understanding that committees can still meet even when we are not officially in session. They just cannot take official action. So being in or out of session over the summer, they could do all the public hearings and so forth. They just couldn't take any votes on any maps. The one thing that I brought up, and this is from my days as a former clerk, is, you know, we're going to get that information end of September, take the time to plug it into maps, do some public hearings on it. And everyone was saying, you got to have it ready by filing in January. And I kind of raised my hand and said, no, you have to have it ready by November 8th, which is just just very few weeks, because you have to have a year's residency where you're going to run. And the look on their faces was I ruined their day, because now I've cut another 6 weeks off of their timeline. But that's a challenge. A real challenge is making sure that you're in the district you want to run in by the 1 year deadline. Sine die, you know, I know that provision's in there, and I know the intent, and I think that it is fraught with possible danger by doing that, but it might be the only way we can get through this summer, you know, needing to do what we have to do. We have to be very cautious, because we have literally made ourselves a full-time legislature, and we don't want it, you don't want it. So we'll have to make sure that that is handled very properly. On the budget, you know, it's a real challenge, probably even more so than not having enough money to spend, is having all of this federal money come in all of a sudden, where you had previously budgeted for, and now you get to plug the holes with one-time either American Rescue Plan or CARES Act money. It has helped. We've been able to double the amount going into our small business boost, is House Bill 1004, I believe. From $30 million, we've been able to boost it to $60 million. And that also freed up some money to put in some other areas, because we had the federal money. We were able to create a tax exemption to follow along with what they had just very recently passed at the federal level on unemployment benefits due to the pandemic. In Indiana, we tax them, and the feds tax them too, but they passed, and they made an announcement 3-4 weeks ago that they would not tax them for this year. So Indiana is going to go along with that and align ourselves with the federal law, so that your unemployment that is because of COVID will be tax exempt for this year, or for the past year. The Senate budget restores the CTE funding for high demand, low wage jobs. In the House, we wanted it focused on high demand, high wage jobs. but that excluded lots of programs that are already in existence and about 160,000 kids that are in those programs. I think it's a really good conversation to have. I would like to see that money remain in the budget because not every student is a high achieving student, but every student deserves the opportunity to be a contributing member of society and have a decent paying job. And if that's in cosmetology or restaurant or food service, then they should have that opportunity as well. Besides that, the schools have invested a lot of money in the infrastructure to have those programs, and we want them to be able to continue that. The Senate budget also has an additional pay down on the teacher pension. That was in the governor's budget. The House took it out. We did this in the last budget and it freed up, we paid down $150 million and it freed up about $70 million per year to be used by school systems. And I think all but 3 or 4 school systems throughout the state ended up giving teachers a raise, much of it because of the money that we put in and paying down that teacher pension. But we've reached the point where paying it down doesn't give you the benefit that we had when we did it 2 years ago. So that will be that'll be an issue to be discussed. A couple of things that were hot bills is there was an ethanol bill, and I don't know if you've been hearing it on the radio because I was very confused. It makes it sound like the farmers are very much against the bill that would, it doesn't even limit ethanol, 15% ethanol. It just requires additional signage on the pumps. But there's an organization, it's basically an ethanol organization who is asking the governor to veto that. I just want to reassure everybody, I checked with the farmers and they do still support the Senate Bill 303 and do want it to pass. The Wetlands Bill has been probably, I don't know if I've gotten, when you get away from the budget, I don't know if I've gotten so much mail on a bill in a long time as our Wetlands Bill, Senate Bill 389. When it went into committee, they were debating on whether to hear it at all, but when it went into committee last Wednesday, Representative Slager introduced an amendment that really got to the heart of what the issue was. And what was happening is IDEM was being a little overzealous in their definitions of wetlands. And Indiana in general has a more stringent definition than the federal government and 40 some other states do. But they were really targeting some farmers. And basically, if you hadn't farmed it in a while or you didn't farm it last year and all of a sudden some cattails have popped up, they were declaring it a wetland. And then you had to go through the remediation process. And it was really limited to a couple of rogue agents, you would say, I might call them. So Representative Slager really got to the heart of the issue is he exempted cropland, not ag land, but cropland from any definition of any kind of wetland and the ephemeral streams. Ephemeral streams are, snow melt, runoff, things like that, that usually dry, but appear every once in a while. And those were occasionally being described as wetlands. So he removed those from any definition. He limited the mitigation on basically a 1-to-1, 1 acre for 1 acre, if you wanted to develop it, instead of, in some cases, you'd had to mitigate with 4 acres of land for every acre that you wanted to use. And he capped or limited the amount of money that could be charged in the remediation process. So it kind of took away the incentive for IDEM to be overly anxious to claim wetlands. So I think he found a really good place to land on that bill. And I believe that there may be an amendment on Monday to add a task force, which is it has more weight than a study committee, to look at our wetlands bill or wetlands laws going forward. A couple of other things. Let's see, I had a few bills. I've never spent so much time learning about eyelashes. I had an eyelash extension bill. And it's an agency issue of, the new trend of adding eyelashes to your existing eyelashes. We're not talking the strip lashes or the falsies that you can get over the counter at Walmart. These are where the people glue an eyelash to each eyelash. I'm sorry, I don't know what it's like to do that. But the professional licensing and the AG were going after some of the places that do this because they said they didn't have a license. So a few of the owners approached me, and basically what I've learned is, because my first question to them was, you're working around my eye with very sharp objects using chemical adhesives. Why wouldn't I want you to have a license? And the response rate made it very clear why we had to go forward with the legislation is because in cosmetology school, they don't teach it. So you're going to require someone to go through 1,500 hours, several $1,000s, and a lot of time to get a license that does not teach them what they want to do. All of this training is brand specific. You have to get it from the manufacturers. So that made sense, and it sailed through the Senate unanimously, I believe, and it had a very good bipartisan vote in the House. I know there are still people who would like to see that licensed. We're not just turning it loose. The State Board of Health is going to run this like they do tattoo parlors, which, believe it or not, even though they are piercing the skin and injecting a foreign substance, that does not require a license. They are only required to pass health and safety, bloodborne pathogen, things like that from the State Board of Health. So we're going to put the eyelash extension artists under the same kind of regulation. It's typically a highly woman-owned business field. A lot of them are single mothers. They set their own schedules. And if they're good at it, they make a lot of money. So we want to support that and keep an eye on that moving forward, because they are truly our entrepreneurs. Let's see, some other bills. I was trying to think of, sometimes I can't remember what I spoke about yesterday and what I'm speaking about today. So I'll just wrap it up because I think the questions might be more interesting than hearing me talk.
Thank you, Representative Mayfield. We really appreciate your service. All right, now we're going to go to questions for the audience. When you're called on by the question moderator, please unmute and turn on your video, state your name, and ask your 1-minute questions. For our legislators, each of you will have an opportunity to answer the question, and we'll have about 2 or 3 minutes to answer. I'll call on you in rotation, which will not be difficult today. So it's not always the same person answering first.
Okay. Jim Borman is the first question asker. Jim, would you unmute and turn on your video and ask your question?
Jim, I think you need to unmute.
It wouldn't be a morning if I had not failed to unmute, so I just wanted to be the first one to do that to break everyone in. Representative Pierce, Representative Mayfield, League, thank you for hosting this and for coming to the meeting this morning. I've followed this week a lot of what Representative Pierce just described regarding the redistricting. I think it's one of the most important things that the legislature can address, and both of you would be affected by it because your districts are overwhelmingly either Republican or Democrat. So I would just, I don't want to hear about the germane issue because that gets kind of esoteric, but I wanted to hear you explain your vote. Why did you vote for, or why did you vote against that proposal? Because it seems a reasonable thing for both sides, and it could affect both of you in in your districts. Thank you.
Let's begin with Representative Mayfield, please. Thank you.
Sure, I would welcome the opportunity to explain that vote. And as much as we don't like it, the procedural vote is an integral part of the legislative process. So The germaneness issue, we have the rules. I don't make the rules. I follow the rules just like everybody else. And so when it came to germaneness, that was, I think, clearly off the table. It was in a different title of the code. But to get to your other part of the question, why did I vote against it? Years ago, and remember, I've been a clerk, I've drawn local legislative districts. So I've worked with the information that they have, or that the other people will work with. Years ago, there was a resolution, I believe it was now Senator Cook had introduced about nonpartisan redistricting committee. And I signed on to that. It was to investigate it. As time has gone on, and as you get into this, I have come to the belief that there is almost nothing, it doesn't matter if it's labeled as nonpartisan, there is literally nothing that is truly nonpartisan because the appointments come from partisan units. And so there is an expectation that the person that is appointed follow the desires of the person appointing them. That aside, the Iowa issue is, we also have to weigh what should be done in committee versus what's done on the fly on the floor. The introduction of the Second Amendment reading that Representative Pierce brought forth was literally the first time that anyone who might not have been on the elections committee had heard of this option. So to expect us to take a vote after a very articulate 15-minute description, I still don't think is a good way to make legislation. I am not ruling it out. I think that it should be brought back and discussed further and more in depth so that each of us understands it better. If it works for Iowa, we can compare what Iowa has versus their statutes versus their constitution with what Indiana has in our statutes and constitution and how it plays out. But to do it, I almost felt it was a knee jerk. It sounds good. And you're starting to appeal to emotion or passion or your sense of what is right. And I wasn't comfortable doing that. I want more information and to be more comfortable when I make that decision. So until I have that, I would vote no.
Thank you. Representative Pierce.
Yes, well, there's a fascinating history to this whole debate over how to draw these maps, and it's been going on for a decade. And there's kind of been a weird rope-a-dope where, you know, maybe 1 year or two, the House will kind of introduce some things that look like they're moving towards some kind of nonpartisan system. And the Senate will say, no, we're not interested. And then the House will lose interest. And then the Senate will do a few things that looks like they're interested in it. And then the House will say, well, we don't think maybe that's the right thing, and kind of ping pongs around. And, you know, the clock is running out. And so, you know, I did attempt to have that amendment considered in committee, in the elections committee, and the chair would not allow the amendment to be voted on. And so that left me with no option but to do the minority committee report, which at least got me an up or down vote on the House floor. It kind of got me around these procedural issues. You know, one reason why I opted to go with this Iowa plan is, one, it's worked pretty well over there. It's been around a long time, so you can really see how it's worked. But the other thing is it avoids this issue of people, because some people said, well, no matter what kind of commission you create, it's going to end up, people are going to have some kind of bias, whether you see it or not, and that's going to end up impacting how the maps get drawn. So you really can't find qualified people to draw maps that don't know anything about politics or something, and so therefore you're not really going to get where you need to be. So that's one issue there. And then the other issue was, well, the Constitution says the General Assembly has to draw these maps in the year after the census, and so you can't offload that to somebody else. Well, what I like about the Iowa plan is it really solves both those problems, because you have Legislative Services Agency, which is nonpartisan. They're lawyers and fiscal people, and the interesting thing is you have like one drafter for a committee, and so I can walk in 1 minute and ask that drafter to draft an amendment that does one thing. A Republican member can walk into that same drafter 5 minutes later and ask them to draw the exact opposite policy. And these professionals down there are used to maintaining confidences and working on both sides and not letting their kind of personal views get in the way. And so I think that they're well positioned to do something like this. There would be the system does have a small kind of committee or commission of 5 people, nonpartisan, that could be referred to by LSA if they felt the statutory guidance wasn't clear enough for them. So they have some people they could refer to. So, you know, there's still an opportunity if the leadership wanted to, because we're going to be in session. As Representative Mayfield pointed out, you know, committees can meet anytime. They may not be able to pass legislation, but they could now if we stay in session. So, you know, you could spend the summer investigating, having public hearings, and thinking about, you know, would the Iowa system work? Would another system work? Does it have to be the way we've always done it? And there'd be plenty of time between now and, say, Labor Day to come up with a system and put it in place.
All right, thank you, Representative Pearson, and thanks, Jim, for your question. Next question?
The next question is from Jim Allison.
Good morning. After each one of our last 2 elections, I had a rather disturbing report from more than one voter. These voters thought that they had registered a local Department of Motor Vehicles office only to find on election day no record of their registration at the polling place. And informed of this, officials advised them and the public in general to simply check their registration status beforehand, which is very good advice. But I wonder if this problem went beyond Monroe County, and I wonder how we can fix this slippage. Thank you.
All right, we'll start with Representative Pierce.
I haven't heard anything about that problem recently. There was, I do remember maybe 5 years ago or so, at some point in the past, this issue did come up and they kind of looked into it. And I think that what they were finding is that the EMV was having people fill out these paper voter registration forms, and then they had to get those physically delivered to the voter registration office, and something was getting botched up with the delivery of that. And I think there was some discussion about maybe going to an electronic system to have people do that, but I haven't heard. So it was certainly an issue in the past. I hadn't heard about it most recently, but it's definitely true that, you know, whether it's a volunteer registering you or you do it at BMV, you really need to kind of follow up. If you don't get that registration card in a couple of weeks, you need to kind of check what's going on. And I know that most people probably don't think that way. They register at the county fair or someplace, and they think they're ready to roll, and they don't think too much about it again. So, Jim, I have to admit that I'm not too up to speed on what's going on with that issue at this point, but I do know it's come up in the past.
Thank you. Representative Mayfield, have you heard anything about this?
Like I said, I have a background as clerk using the SVRS, the statewide voter registration system, and each situation might be a little bit different, but it does happen. I think part of it is I thought there was a confirmation that was sent to the voter that they may or may not have missed, and and I think that they're told, as I recall, to expect that card in 7 to 10 days. If it's the electronic registration, like when you're doing a transaction, not every transaction at the BMB required the voter registration. It was really just the credentials. So if you were renewing your plates, it wasn't an automatic thing. So if you renewed your driver's license, it is electronically sent to the clerk's office, and then it's downloaded. On election day, when we would have issues, we could go back and look at the electronic download and tell the polling place over the phone, yes, they are registered, and here's the information, and let them vote, or let them vote a provisional ballot, and we'll straighten it out once we get it back in the election office. Sometimes they do, as Representative Pierce indicated. On other issues, they do it by paper. And a few years ago, we required any third party that was doing like a volunteer voter registration event had to put their personal name on it, so that and give that to the voter, so that if they didn't get a voter registration card when they showed up at the polls and weren't registered, there would be a record of who did it, so that a provisional ballot could be offered. Jim, it all depends on the circumstances of each individual one. There are ways to do it. If something fell through the cracks, there are ways to allow the voter to vote. Most of the time, though, they just get frustrated and leave. And clerks try to avoid that scenario. But a lot of times, it is also the easiest excuse for someone who simply forgot, is to say, I did this so-and-so place, and there's no record, because it's very possible it never actually happened. And that's a low number of cases, but it happens. Not everybody's honest.
Thank you. And thanks, Jim, for your question. Next question.
The next question is from Kathy Roundtree.
Hi, good morning. I heard recently that people who are incarcerated in Indiana are not eligible for coverage under Medicaid. And I wondered if you could talk about if that's true, and if so, could you talk about the history of that policy and what funding options are available to counties to provide for the health care of incarcerated people? Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. We'll start with Representative Mayfield.
And I wish I had a good answer for you, Kathy, because I've heard the same thing. I am just now starting to get into some Medicaid issues on below the surface. So I'm going to defer this for the history if Representative Pierce can answer it.
Yeah, I think that's changing. I don't have a full handle on it, but I think the previous policy was that people who are in prison are being punished and they shouldn't be getting free health care or some kind of taxpayer support. That was the general philosophy behind it. So people were incarcerated, were not eligible for Medicaid. Well, I think what's happened is since the ACA passed and some other things, and the fact that the cost then got borne by the local jails, because they had to provide for the health care of the people in there, or the Department of Corrections. And so now I'm pretty sure that policy is turned around. And in fact, they're now aggressively trying to get people onto to Medicaid, because they rather have the 80% federal match to cover these costs. And so I'm just not sure I know exactly where that transition process is or how aggressive it's being done. I also know that the DOC now has these programs where they prepare people to leave prison. And one of the things they do is make sure that they've gotten registered and signed up for HIP 2.0, so they actually have health care when they get out and some of those things. But I'm pretty sure I'd have to go back and double check where we are in the process. But I think that now we've kind of done a 180 on that. And now the effort is like, okay, as many people as we can get eligible for those types of programs, that takes the financial burden off the locals or the state if we can get some of that federal money applied.
Thank you. Do you have just a follow-up? Do you have an idea as to where one could go to get more information and what the current status is on this?
Yeah, if you could go ahead and just send me an email, I'll track down the specifics on that and send you back a more specific answer.
Okay.
So you can just send it to probably H as in house 61 at IGA, like Indiana General Assembly, .in.gov.
Okay, thank you.
So just send me an email and repeat the question for me, and I'll track down a more specific answer for you.
Okay, thanks so much, both of you.
All righty, Ralph, who's up next?
The next question is from Dave Askins.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. I'm not going to turn on my video because I'm not looking exactly presentable right now. I have a question about House Bill 1114 on the ability of local municipalities to regulate design standards for buildings. It seems like it's died, but at last month's legislative update, Representative Jeff Ellington seemed to express some optimism about that actually moving forward. So I'm wondering if you can give us an idea of what might have led to the demise of that legislation. And the reason I ask is that design standards are one key to Bloomington's Unified Development Ordinance use standards for duplexes. And the design standards basically say, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, that a duplex has to look like other single-family houses on the block. Anyway, why did that bill die? Or maybe it's not actually dead. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Askins. And we'll start with Representative Pierce.
Well, I think it's dead because the Republican caucus in the House decided that the bill was a little too controversial or wasn't the right policy, whatever. So the bill just didn't get progressed from there. Now, it's true that, the number one truth of the legislature is it's never over till it's over. You have some conference committees, things show up in the budget you would never imagine are in the budget, and stuff can happen. So sometimes really determined legislators can pull a rabbit out of their hat and find something nestled in a bill, and then it's on its way, and it's like, how did that happen? But I think in this case, bills like this that attract a great deal of attention and a great deal of controversy, in leadership, and my experience is when the majority caucus looks at it and says, well, okay, this is not really quite ready to go, and they no longer advance the bill. It's pretty unusual for that to just then suddenly pop up in a conference committee someplace, but anything is possible until we leave here in a couple weeks.
Representative Mayfield.
Okay, so we talk about, pulling a rabbit out of the hat, and I mentioned earlier the rules, and whether we like them or not, we follow them. I believe the rule is that the language actually has to pass one chamber to be eligible to pop up somewhere else. And believe me, if you know the rules and how to play the game, and I say that loosely, you can be more successful. But it gets harder and harder as you start eliminating the possibilities. Not only was some of the language a bit controversial, I still think it had the votes to pass. It would have been on a narrow margin. So again, as with many bills that start out in one position, you bring them back a couple year after year, you build on the support till you get that critical mass to pass it. And I think that some people, and we have a lot of new members. So bringing them up to speed on the impact, what it meant. And I think the final nail in the coffin was that the author is a builder. And a lot of media attention got transferred. It didn't start out that way, but toward the end, as it was coming up for the vote, there was a lot of criticism about Representative Miller being a builder and whether that was a conflict of interest. And there's very narrow definition of conflict of interest, but it did not look good. So I think you'll see it again in future years. It will probably not be carried by a builder. It'll be carried by someone unrelated to the building industry who knows the backstory on the bill and can move it forward. So like I said, as Representative Pierce said, it's really not dead, but probably is for this session.
Great, thank you. Ready for our next question?
Okay, our final question in the list so far is from Sherry Frank.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you, Representative Mayfield and Representative Pierce for being here. We really appreciate you. I wanted to follow up on the redistricting questions. One of the questions that was talked about was who draws the maps and how to make that actually nonpartisan. The other part of the question is, though, what is the criteria that should be applied to the maps? And I wanted to see if you have some input on that. And I wanted to find out if you have any plans to participate in or hear from the Indiana Citizens Redistricting Commission and the criteria that they've been receiving from the public, and if you plan to consider the maps they're inviting citizens to draw and look at the competition. Thank you.
Thanks, Sherry. Representative Mayfield, you're up.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry. I think I wasn't around the last time this happened. Again, I hate to say I was a clerk, so I was watching it very carefully. And Indiana did provide software that the public could use and submit their own maps for consideration. So there was that input. The criteria, I think, is provided mostly by federal law, you know, communities of interest, boundaries, not dividing counties unless you had to, not dividing census blocks, et cetera. Those are all spelled out. And even though you use those, and I mentioned drawing our local districts, if they had submitted my districts, which were, you know, the deviation in my districts was less than 1%. I got it that good. But if that had been challenged in court, they would have been challenging on stuff that's not in the rules. They would be challenging race and ethnicity and economic background, you know, the wealthy and non-wealthy. So those things aren't in the guidelines, but that's what they challenge. So it's very hard to draw those maps. But the public input, to go back to your question on, do I plan on listening to them? I don't know if you meant me personally or just as, you know, that will the legislature be watching that? We always welcome input and weigh it and then accept or discard it based on what's presented.
Okay, I guess it's my turn. So it is true that traditionally in the last round or two, there have been software and other things made available so that if any member of the public wanted to come in and sit down and attempt to draw their own map and kind of see how to do it and maybe make their pitch to the legislature why that is the map that should get adopted, they could do that. I've been pretty cynical about that. I think that's just kind of designed to make the public feel like there's some input, because the truth is the majority party is going to be drawing those maps in a back room someplace, and then they're going to show up and get presented in committee. And at that point, you know, it is public and people can try to amend it in committee or on the floor of the House and, you know, critique it and complain about it. And I suppose that maybe if the public had such a negative reaction to a map, maybe the majority would think twice about it, but that's a little bit unusual. And so I don't think that it's very easy for the outside public to really impact this kind of decision. It's so different because it has a direct impact on all the individual members. And so if you're in the majority party and you know that you have a set of maps that are going to help you preserve your majority, you can withstand a fair amount of public heat because you know at the end of the day, those maps are going to shield you from any public, you know, upset about what you might have done on those maps. And so that becomes very difficult. I have been kind of from afar watching the Citizen Commission, this coalition have put together. And in fact, one reason why I brought up the importance of how the session's handled when we come back in October, whenever it might be, is if the majority wants to, after the bill's voted out of committee, they could suspend all the rules and literally just have an hour or two debate on it and pass the thing on through. And, you know, within a couple hours, the House and the Senate can act and that'll be it. And it's off to the governor to be signed. And you would not have an opportunity to offer any second reading amendments under that scenario. If they go for a more fuller multi-day process, then the minority party will have an opportunity to offer some alternatives and have some votes on that. And it's my intention that once that Citizen Commission gets done and they kind of identify what they think is the best map, you know, drawn without kind of partisan input, I'm going to offer that map if I have the opportunity, probably on a second reading amendment, and that will at least give the membership an opportunity to choose between the kind of inside map that was drawn or this map that was drawn through a more public process.
Thank you.
Okay.
Next question.
Yeah, we have another, one more question, and then we'll be going to people who have a second question after this one. This question is from Charlotte Zitlow. You unmute, Charlotte, and ask your question.
Hey, am I unmuted?
Yes. Yeah.
But okay, I'd like you, Matt, I'd like you to expand on the public status of funding for public schools. I am a member of a board of a charter school, which is also a public school, by the way. And I'm appalled at the lack of funding or the reduction of expansion of funding for public schools, because that is where the people go. That's a really important function of democracy, to have people educated as well as possible in the public schools. So I'm bothered by what seems to be a lack of interest in the public schools per se, and the increase in the voucher program. Could you speak to that?
Thank you, Charlotte. We'll begin with Representative Pierce.
Yeah, so like a lot of things is kind of how you look at it. So I'm sure that Peggy will give us the overall number, and that's usually what Republicans look to and say, okay, overall, dedicated education, you know, the big pot, this number's way up. And I think the Senate actually increased it even more. But really the more important question, other than the big number, is, you know, how does it actually filter out down then to individual schools? And so you have to look at the school funding formula and kind of see how the money's going to flow down. And then you also have to look at what percentage of that increase or that money is going to go to fund private school vouchers or this new educational savings account that is being proposed. And so right now the Senate has kind of squeezed down the private side of it a bit. And I think they've increased what they call the complexity formula, which is designed to deal with, I think, special ed kids with special needs that theoretically are more expensive to educate because they need more specialized instruction. And so I think that's kind of a plus. But it's kind of hard to know until you get like the school runs and you see how the formula plays out for your particular school districts. And then you have to see, you know, overall how much of that money is going into the private school system versus the public school system. And I probably don't have to tell people who've been coming to these meetings because you pay pretty careful attention, but you know that I've not been in favor of diverting any public school or taxpayer dollars into these private programs. But that has clearly been the policy for the last, I guess, decade now. Of the majority, and they keep expanding it. So one of the things to look at is what will happen in conference committee, because I know that Speaker Houston seemed to make it pretty clear that the House Republicans would be fighting to push those private school dollars back up and the ESA money back up, and the Senate appears to want it to be lower. So we'll just have to see, you know, how all that settles out.
Thank you. Representative Mayfield?
Yes, thank you. It's no secret that I'm a supporter of school choice, but as far as reduction, and I hear a lot about people saying you're cutting public school funding. Well, since I've been there, we've increased it almost $2 billion. And since the money follows the child, we are not cutting school funding. If you're not educating the child, the money is going to whatever method that they choose. I think that there are a couple things that also need to be looked at. One is the complexity formula. That's the odd thing about that is that if you have whatever it is determined to be the complexity formula, it isn't just applied to the kids who qualify as, you know, socioeconomically challenged. It's retroactive to the entire school district's population. Even the children who come from wealthy families, they are counted toward that complexity in that formula on a per student basis. The special needs grants and those types of things are student specific, but the complexity applies to all the students. And right now, I think it's dropped a little bit. I think traditional public schools are now educating about 91%. I think it used to be around 93%, depending on what data you look at. So let's just say if 91% of the students are attending traditional public schools, they are still getting a disproportionately higher amount of money per child. They're getting in that 92% range of the funding. Plus, they get the property tax on an average of $3,000 per child more. That does not go to the charter schools. It does not go to the voucher schools. And as a matter of fact, the vouchers are only at 90% of what the school funding would give to a traditional public school. Charter schools get 100% of the student funding. They do not get property taxes. They do get an allocation. I think it's $750 right now, and I think it's proposed to either go to $1,000 or $1,500 because there is no property tax to go along with them. But that's still a lot lower than what traditional public schools get in the property tax values. I think that traditional public schools also need to look at, and so do all the other schools, but our birth rate is dropping. So in 5 years, we're not going to see as many kindergartners, and those kindergartners are not going to be in the 5th and 6th grade. So as families are choosing not to have children, I think we ought to look at that in the long term in order to not have these empty buildings and have to argue over the $1 charter school or trying to maintain buildings that are not full of students. I think we need to take a longer look at that. But the policy is the money follows the child to whichever method of education is the best fit, and that is decided by the student and the parent.
All right, thank you. Ralph, who's up next?
Okay, the next question is from Dave Askins.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. I have a question about SB 218 on township homeless assistance. And before I dive into the question, I just want to take a second to thank Representatives Mayfield and Pierce for taking a chunk of their Saturday morning to answer questions from constituents. It's a sign, I think, that at least this part of our democracy is actually working. So thank you very much. My question on this Senate Bill 218 on township homeless assistance, it now includes a definition of aggressive harassment. It repeals some legislation on panhandling and then inserts this new definition on aggressive harassment. Says, as used in this chapter, harasses means unwanted contact with a person that would cause a reasonable person to suffer emotional distress or fear. And then it goes on to say an individual who harasses another person with the intent to obtain property from the other person commits aggressive harassment, Class C misdemeanor. So, to me, that chunk of amendment doesn't seem really germane to the intent of the original bill. And so I'm wondering if either representative might be able to give some insight into how the concept of germaneness applies to that particular amendment and why it's a good idea to have this bill, which seems to be about providing assistance to homeless people. Suddenly it has this, to my mind, kind of a weird amendment describing penalties for aggressive harassment. Thanks, that's the question.
Great, thank you. Representative Mayfield?
Okay, I'm gonna make sure that Matt has an opportunity to correct me if I am wrong, but I believe that language started out in the House from Representative Moed for the Indianapolis area. Last year or year before, we had a panhandling statute that was passed and it was thrown out by the courts, considered whether it was too vague or whether it was a violation of free speech. So Representative Moed, who does represent a lot of the downtown area of Indianapolis, brought it back under the harassment. And that would be that a homeless person could not harass another member of the public. And they wanted to get a study in about low barrier homeless shelters. This was his effort to really try to address a big problem in his district. And we put it in the House. He had it in a House bill, and I'm not sure that bill continued moving in the Senate. So we inserted his language that had passed the House into this bill and basically sent it back to the Senate for their okay. As far as germaneness goes, the Senate rules are different from the House rules. And germaneness can be stretched out to mean whatever you'll accept as germane. If you are the author and like it, you can accept it. Sometimes you have the parliamentarian saying, no, it's not germane, and they pull it out. So there's no hard, fast rule on that. It kind of depends on what's in the bill and how much do you really want to fight it.
Thank you. Representative Pierce?
Yeah, the short answer is germaneness rules doesn't really apply in the committees. I mean, if a committee chair wants to say, hey, I don't think it's germane, so I'm not going to let you have a vote on it, that rarely happens because the truth is the way the rules are set up, the chairs of committees have total and complete control. They can refuse to hear a bill, have a vote on it, kill it because they think it's bad policy. When they get into a committee hearing, I mean, some committee chairs are willing to let people offer their amendments and have them debated and voted on up and down, and that's it. Other committee chairs are much more controlling, and they basically say, okay, I got 6 amendments in front of me. We're only going to vote on these 2. The rest of you guys lose. And that's the power that they have. So germaneness is really not applied in the committee. I mean, it might get brought up or somebody might say, hey, you really shouldn't put this in here. But the proof that it doesn't apply in committee, and I think I mentioned this on the House floor during debate on redistricting or some other provision, is when you get toward the end of the session, what happens is House members figure out that the Senate is killing a bunch of their bills. And so in order to force the Senate to deal with those bills, someone will load up, they'll take like 3 or 4 bills that are stalled in the Senate, and they'll basically cram them into a Senate bill that's being considered in the House. And it goes back to them, and that forces them to have to dissent and go in the conference committee. And now the House has the ability to kind of resurrect whatever was getting killed off over there. So it can get very convoluted. This particular bill had some different twists and turns because it started out as that simple township bill. And then Representative Moed was trying to deal with an initial issue of the problem of a lot of abandoned buildings, a lot of abandoned residences in Indianapolis, and a lot of squatters going in there, and then drug activity occurring and things, and having a difficult time being able to get the squatters out of there under the existing laws. And he was trying to add in some tools to deal with that. And then as the bill is moving, the Indianapolis Chamber showed up, and the issue of panhandling is all about downtown Indianapolis right now, although I'm sure people in Bloomington will say we have our share of that as well. But what basically Indianapolis leaders were saying to the legislature is like, we are getting super negative feedback on our hosting of conventions. Of course, this is mostly pre-COVID because it's been a little bit down. But they essentially said, you know, we got people telling us they're not coming back to Indianapolis again because there's such a high concentration of people panhandling right in that kind of core of, downtown near the sports venues and things. And so the leadership of Indianapolis is basically saying, General Assembly, you've got to give us some tools to be able to have this area free of all this panhandling. And so the question is, how do you do that constitutionally? Because you have a constitutional right to ask people for money. And so there was one attempt at that a couple of years ago. The court said, nope, not good enough. That's a violation of the First Amendment. So now it's being come at with this kind of aggressive panhandling idea. And so that's why the germaneness thing didn't apply. Another saying about germaneness is in the eye of the beholder. So on my redistricting amendment, I thought that was completely germane to a bill labeled various election matters. But the speaker said, no, you got a Title II bill in a different volume of the code than the Title III election stuff, and it's fine, and therefore I don't think it matches. So oftentimes it's just up to the whims of whoever gets to decide.
All right, great. Ralph, do we have another question?
We have 2 more questions, so I think maybe that will be enough to finish us out. The next one is from Sherry Frank.
Hi, thank you again for being here. You guys are, it's just so helpful to hear your opinions. I wanted to follow up on education. I hear the saying that the money follows the child. And I'm not a lawyer, but I read the Indiana State Constitution says or mandates funding of common schools. And it also prohibits the transfer of state funds to religious institutions. So I am just wondering how this move to expand ESAs and vouchers applies. I don't think anybody has any, well, I personally don't have any issue with school choice as far as letting parents send their children wherever they want to go. But I think tax dollars are intended to support public schools, and it seems to be stated so in the Constitution. So I'm just wondering how that gets explained.
Thank you, Sherry. We'll begin with Representative Pierce.
Yeah, so on the issue of tax dollars going to religious institutions, there was a state Supreme Court ruling on that probably a decade ago, pretty quickly after the voucher system went in place. And I didn't agree with the decision, but what the court essentially said is even though the money's going from the state directly to the institution through these warrants or whatever, that it's only going there because the parent directed it to go there. And so they essentially said that it's really not the state funding a religious school, it's a parent choosing to give this money, the state's giving the parent to go to the school. So what that essentially means is the Indiana State Supreme Court thinks it's just fine for taxpayer dollars to be used to support religious-based schools. So that's kind of off the table based on that particular ruling. The issue of funding a system of common schools, I mean, that's another interesting issue. I suppose I don't know if that's ever been litigated. I suppose the argument there would be like, well, the public schools still exist, they're still there, they are getting funded at a level. And so the other programs don't, have not stopped this common school system from being created. I'll just say that, on the policy front, my concern always has been that as these programs continue to expand over the years, I'm concerned that we're going to get, we already have kind of a two-tiered society. I mean, we're kind of sorting ourselves out by where we live, socioeconomic levels. And, my concern is that we're going to get to a point where you have, one set of parents, maybe the parents that are very engaged, very focused on their kids' education. They may be moving their kids out of the public schools and putting them in these private schools. And then you might reach a point in the future where the public schools essentially are just educating the lower socioeconomic rung of people, the people really struggling, the people who are less politically connected and know less about or have less time to try to influence what happens at the legislature. And I think that if you get to that tipping point, then I think it's going to be very difficult to maintain good support for those schools. And then you can talk about another big philosophical issue is, there are a lot of people who say that, it's very important to have a classroom that is diverse, that has people from different backgrounds, different economic levels, and, so that people, have that experience that if we kind of sort ourselves out and we have an elite set of schools for people who maybe can afford it or have the wherewithal to apply for these programs, then you're going to end up with kind of a sorted out system. And so so I have a longer term kind of concern about just the general trajectory of all this.
Thank you. Representative Mayfield?
I agree. Matt referred to the Indiana State Supreme Court ruling that said that the money following the child at the direction of the parent is perfectly legal. When it comes, if you look back about the funding, it was if you had a chance to look at the charts, 10 years ago, we had schools getting $15,000 a child versus some schools getting, $5,000 a child. And through the changes that we have done with the school funding formula over a decade, little by little, we have brought them all to a very, very similar trajectory on the school funding. Everybody is pretty much getting the same base. And so everyone has the same amount of money relatively to fund the child. As far as as far as diversity, you know, the vast majority of student choice in education is public to public transfers. It isn't the charters and it isn't the vouchers. It's another public school system that has a program that better fits, whether it's academics, whether it's athletics, extracurriculars, just a better teacher, whether my parent, teaches there. But the vast majority is public to public transfers, which doesn't really show up on the school funding reports. Just because we have vouchers and charters have been around for 20 years, and we're still at 4 or 5% of the population choose a charter school. Vouchers have been around for 10 years, and we're still at that 3 to 4%. So it's not as if just the fact that we have them, that everyone's going to bail out of the public schools. 91% of our kids still attend public schools. 91% of those families still think that the public school is the best choice for their child for a lot of different reasons, but they're still choosing public schools. And so that this is not going to kill public schools. I think that it does cause them to take a very good look at what they offer, how they offer it, and what their future offerings will be, though.
All right, thank you. Ralph, our next and possibly last question.
Next question is from Jim Bowman.
Good morning again. Last couple weeks ago, my 18-year-old neighbor was murdered in Bloomington by a 16-year-old over an ounce of marijuana. Guns were a concern of mine, but it was never incredibly personal. I saw this girl grow up and her life is over. At the same time, I saw that the legislature appears to be weakening the laws dealing with guns, at least from the perspective that I was reading and seeing and hearing, rather than strengthening it. What's going on as far as the gun issue, and what do you think can be done to promote gun safety?
Thanks, Jim. Representative Mayfield.
Yeah, Jim, that's an absolute tragedy, and I saw that story. 2 lives lost, one permanently, the other destroyed. And I almost want to ask, what law could we have created to avoid that isn't already on the books? That 16-year-old broke a series of laws in committing the crime that he did. I don't believe that the Lawful Carry Bill weakens any law that's already there. It merely reduces the obligation to pay for a license. If you are ineligible for license under current law, you would be ineligible to carry a handgun without the license. It doesn't change who gets to carry it, where they get to carry it, whether or not they get to buy it. None of that changed. It just removed the requirement for a license.
All right, thank you. And Representative Pierce.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is those, the bill to basically get rid of the concealed carry permits, apparently the Senate thought better of that. And so they've decided not to move that bill, but they are, I think in the budget or someplace, they're essentially going to say if you apply for, a one-time lifetime permit, that the fee of that will be waived. And in order to make those fees right now go to local law enforcement to do their training and things. And so the state is going to replace whatever revenue might be lost by getting rid of that. And so they're essentially saying to people like, well, if you're mad because you think the Constitution gives you a right to conceal, carry a weapon without getting any permission or permit from the state, we can't do that for you, but hey, just apply once and then you'll have the thing for life and we'll give it to you for free. So that's kind of where that issue stands. There was another bill that dealt with making it clear that it's legal to point a weapon at someone theoretically in self-defense, which is a little controversial. That was scheduled for a hearing in a courts committee, and then at the last minute, the chair decided not to move forward on that bill. I don't know if that'll pop up somewhere in conference committee or not, but it looks like a lot of the legislation related to guns is kind of gone off the road here toward the end. And I would just say that, you know, my frustration is obviously there's a very broad gap. I mean, you have a lot of people in the legislature who think the Second Amendment is kind of an absolute right, and that people should be able to have whatever kind of weapons they want under whatever circumstances. And that's just the way it is. And that's how they approach, you know, any proposal of legislation in the area of guns. You know, my frustration is I think that the vast majority of people are in a place where they think there's some common sense things that you could do that might reduce the likelihood of mass shootings and some of this gun violence. But you can't ever really get it to a vote, whether it's in Congress or in the state legislature, because you have so many people are just kind of really nailed down with their positions. And, you know, I agree it's difficult to identify any one legal provision to solve the problem because we are just awash in weapons. I mean, there are more guns in the United States now, and I think people, is my understanding. And so, you know, no matter what you do going forward, you're still going to have a legacy of the policies in place that have, you know, made guns of all types readily available. And that's, you know, the difficulty. And so, again, I mean, we've talked a lot about this over the years, but you've also got, you know, kind of cultural differences. So people in rural areas have a different viewpoint than guns when they see guns as, you know, going out and hunting and, you know, things like that. And you have people in urban areas, they encounter weapons, you know, maybe when they're getting robbed or their neighbors killed, or, you know, they kind of see the, you know, the real negative use of guns. And so you get these divisions in how people look at it. But I'm just frustrated that we can't find a way to get some common ground on just some, you know, basic things like background checks and things like that might possibly keep some people from getting guns that shouldn't have them.
All right. Thank you both for your responses to that. I think we have time for one more question if we have one.
No, that's all the questions people have raised to me.
Okay, great. Well, somewhat related to the previous question, the legislation, the bill related to marijuana did not move forward. Is there any chance of any legislation in the future related to medical marijuana or legalizing marijuana as other states have done, or is that just dead in here in Indiana? Representative Pierce, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, right now it appears that there's little appetite on the part of the legislature to deal with that issue. I mean, there are some people, Representative Lucas, who's I would call him a super libertarian. He's a very conservative member. And, you know, he's been, you know, kind of beating people up, trying to get, you know, something moving on that front. But, you know, the governor has said that as far as he's concerned, the state shouldn't do anything on legalization of marijuana or medical marijuana until the federal government removes marijuana from the list of Schedule I drugs. And but there are so many states, just, you know, each month goes by, it seems like another state legalizes it or decriminalizes it in some way. And we're now getting kind of surrounded by states that have different policies. The one bill that is moving, I've kind of lost track of where it is in the process because we put it in a couple different places and I'm not sure what the Senate's been doing on it. But one of the things that is there is an attempt to address is, you know, one of the difficulties that comes up when people talk about legalization of marijuana is they say, well, what about impaired driving, right? So if everyone gets, you know, high and then they start driving, just like drunk driving, that could be a danger. And unlike alcohol, where you can apply a breathalyzer and you can see you can get a sense of the blood alcohol content, and we know what the presence of alcohol in the blood does to impair people. Marijuana is different, where apparently you can have, you know, residual amounts of marijuana in your system a long time after you smoke marijuana. So you could be in an accident and not be impaired at all. And in fact, the accident would not even be your fault. And you could end up being charged with a crime if you have any residue of marijuana in your system. And there's systems where if you have serious bodily injury or a death in a driving accident, they're automatically people's blood is checked. And so you can end up with this weird unjust thing where, let's say, maybe someone goes to Michigan where it's legal to consume marijuana. They consume it up there maybe on a weekend. And then maybe a week later, they're involved in an accident. It's not their fault. Someone dies. Their blood gets checked. Oh, you have residue of marijuana. That makes you impaired. Now you're going to be facing, a criminal conviction. So there's an attempt to change the laws on that to recognize that you have this residual thing. Now, one way you can do it is you can talk about how many nanograms or something that are in the system, and the prosecutors don't like that at all. So they kind of backed off of that. And they're just trying to come up with some like rebuttable presumption kinds of things that will help out in that situation. But we're going to have more and more of, I think, these kinds of issues come up as more and more states around us legalize marijuana.
Thanks. Representative Mayfield?
Yeah, out of the couple dozen states that allow marijuana, only 2 have passed it through their General Assembly. All of the rest of them passed it through referendum. And they have all come back and said, including the governor of Colorado, said they would never do it that way again. It doesn't mean that they wouldn't legalize it, but they wouldn't do it through referendum. Because you know who writes the referendum? The marijuana industry. And what they have found is, it's the expenses to the states in a lot of different ways, ways you never thought about. The amount of money that's being transported and the armored cars and the required locations where they have to drop it behind 2, locked garage doors. All of that falls onto the local government. The machines that count it, there's a very sticky residue that clogs them all up and they're very expensive to fix. Anyway, those are just things that have come up. They just said, if you consider it, do it through the legislative process, not through the referendum process, which Indiana doesn't really have anyway. But right now, as far as saving a marijuana bill, and I think that it will continue to come up and eventually pass. I don't know if that means 2 years or 10 years. We go back to Sunday alcohol laws on that. But the realigning, we currently have a law, or the federal law allows the flower is legal. And Indiana law took that provision out in a bill. It kind of slipped it through an IPAC. The prosecutors are against the legalization of the flower. Representative Eberhardt and Representative Judy are huge proponents in my caucus about, Delta 9, THC. You are getting a little technical. My chemistry background is, my chemistry teacher is probably rolling in their grave if they heard me talk about it. But there are aspects of it. It is federally legal, and Indiana still wants to make that illegal. And businesses have been operating for the past 18 months. When we legalized it initially, they've been operating, and now we're going to make that entire business illegal. So we're trying to salvage that part of the law to continue making the cannabis flower legal in Indiana. So one bite at a time, as an older generation of legislators retires, and the conversation is more about the possibilities. I think that you will eventually see that in Indiana. I'm just not sure in what form, and will it go all the way to recreational, or will it just be medicinal, or what will that look like?
All right, thank you. Well, this concludes the legislative updates for this session of the Indiana General Assembly. You can continue to follow the work of the General Assembly on their website, iga.in.gov. That provides a wealth of information and allows you to track the progress of individual bills. You can also follow their work through local and state media. Everyone who registered today will receive a follow-up email with additional information. And in closing, I'd like to thank Ralph Shaw for making the arrangements for this program, and also the other league members who assisted. Be sure to check the CAT schedule for any rebroadcast of this session. Finally, thanks to our legislators for being here today to share current legislative information with us. And thank you all for attending. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday, and we'll see you in 2022.